Welcome into the Autzen Audibles Podcast. Eric Scopel, Jared Mack, I'm Matt Preem on today's show. It's our preview show. Happy Thanksgiving if you're listening to this show on Thursday. Hopefully it was great if it was on Friday. Oregon, Washington, Husky Hate Week, 117th meeting between these two teams. It's played as the last game of the year this time around, and it will continue to be that way moving forward. Oregon is number one in the college football playoff rankings. They are 11-0. The Huskies, they have gotten bowl eligible. They're 6-5, 4-4 in the Big Ten. And they're coming in playing spoiler, and it's and I use program, not this team specifically, with the confidence and the carryover of 3 straight over Oregon. Dan Lanning's never beaten Washington. It's a different team, completely different team, different coaching staff. But nonetheless, that's probably going to build some built-in confidence for this Washington team to come to Eugene and try and pull off a massive upset. I think they're like 19-point underdogs to Oregon. But nonetheless, it's a rivalry game, and it's one that feels like it's pretty pivotal, even though Oregon's locked in their spot in the college football playoff and they're in the Big Ten championship game. So like nothing really changes here or there from a big scope of things for their postseason perspectives, but Oregon's got to win this game.
Yeah, I actually, to your point on the college football playoff, I think it does change if they lose this game. If they were to lose, and again, now I hate to start the show getting into negatives, but in terms of what's at stake for Oregon here, if they were to lose this game and then lose to Ohio State, I'm not so sure. Like, are we sure they're hosting? Like, in terms of the opening round?
Probably not. Two-loss team?
Maybe.
It gets iffy, right?
Maybe the 8th seed probably. If they did.
Yeah, right. And so it gets a little iffy. And again, I fully expect, I don't expect they're going to enter the CFP with 2 losses. Duck fans, don't get mad at me for bringing that up early on in the show. I'm just saying in terms of what's at stake is you want to avoid falling apart towards the end of the season. And I have very little doubt that they'll take care of business this weekend, just to be clear. But I do think that's what's at stake here. And I find, by the way, the rivalry kind of part of this to be really interesting in terms of what the messaging has been from Oregon coaches and players this week. It's been kind of downplayed a little bit. Not that this isn't a game that means a lot, but just the I mean, I know Jeff Bossy yesterday, I asked him about kind of like what it would mean to lose or what it would mean to end the streak there in terms of losses. And like they're just focused on one game at a time, playing the game, winning the game. That's not like the overarching aspect of this. And I think that makes a lot of sense because if you're Oregon, why does last year and the year before that really matter? This year, you've been clearly the better team between these two. And frankly, Washington hasn't shown its ability to take its show on the road and play good against anybody, right? I think they're 6-0 at home and 0-5 on the road this year, I believe is the split. And so I think Oregon should be really confident. Oregon should feel really good about these matchups. We'll get into some of that over the course of the show, but yeah, there's obviously a lot at stake here. And for the fans, especially, you don't want to go and have a season kind of ruined, quote unquote, by Washington, your rival, which has beat you the last 2 years. So I think it almost means a little bit more to us on the outside in terms of the specifics of the losing to Washington part. Obviously, Oregon and the players have no desire to ruin what has been an awesome start to a season by losing a game. But the specifics of the Washington thing, I think is probably more our kind of chatter than the ones they're having in the building. At least that's the message we're getting, which could be totally the opposite of what's going on behind closed doors.
Yeah, I imagine there's a bunch of talk behind closed doors about Washington and needing to beat them in this meeting because like we said earlier, Dan hasn't beat them. They lost twice last year. They can say all the right things, but we know every week when those weekly videos come out and you see the behind the scenes action, it's like Dan says motivation doesn't matter. It's all about execution. It's like, yeah, fucking right. Like you guys are motivating all the time with different instances and using Gladiator as a motivate. Like the motivation factors are there. They've done it for as long as they've been producing those Ducks versus Them things was started last year. You've seen all of the motivating factors behind the scenes. So they're saying what they need to say. Like 2 years ago, they came out with their hair on fire. They were, had the Washington fight song going on. They lost that game at Autzen. Then the next year it was like a little bit of chirping in between the first meeting of them and then the second meeting. There wasn't a lot. It was like, this is just the next game. We're here to go out, execute, and win. So I think this is exactly what Oregon's trying to do is just kind of like mellow it out and say that this is the next game. But I have no doubt in my mind that behind the scenes there is certainly some external and internal motivation going on for people who were there last year who saw this. And for the coaching staff, who this is like the last hump they need to get over. Like they beat Ohio State in the first year that they're in the Big Ten, and Michigan, but they have not beat Washington over the last 2 years. So it's certainly something to look forward to. Washington will always want to play spoiler. Any team will want to play spoiler in this matchup, but certainly, this is kind of reminiscent to 2 years ago against Oregon State, where obviously there was a trip to the Pac-12 title game on the line. Oregon loses. This year is a little different because Oregon's already clinched. But boy, wouldn't it feel good if you're Washington and you're a Washington fan to end this perfect season so far for Oregon. And that's something the Ducks have to overcome. Both teams coming off of a bye. I think that's important to note. Oregon certainly needed it. Washington beat UCLA before heading into the bye. They're going to come out firing too. They both had 2 weeks to prepare for each other. So I should be, closely and hotly contested game, but this might not be, we all saw what Washington was last season. This is not the same type of team. It's a very different team. Not that they're not good or anything like that, but they're no world beaters like they were last year with a bunch of NFL talent.
Oregon hasn't lost 4 straight to Washington since a stretch from 91 to 90, or 1990 to 93. It's been a long time since they've lost 4 straight. But let's start with Washington because Jared talked about it. There's a different team this time around, and we'll start at quarterback where Jed Fish this week has said he's shown he's not afraid to play 2 quarterbacks. He's played multiple guys at this position this season, and he won't really tell the public, and nor should he, who's starting at quarterback because they brought in Will Rogers, a transfer. And it was going to be their version of Dylan Gabriel, and as the season's kind of gone sideways a little bit, the true freshman Demon Williams Jr. has kind of gotten himself into the game, and then it's turned into now we're rotating, and now we're playing maybe him. They're 2 different quarterbacks, and that's going to present a challenge for Oregon to face against on Saturday.
Yeah, so I did, by the way, enlist Husky fan Sam again. Longtime listeners will remember this is a buddy of mine who's a Washington fan, and just to get a scouting report, Husky, and he really hopes Will Rogers doesn't play in this game. I don't know if that's the consensus among the Washington fan base, but I don't think there's a lot of support or belief in him right now. Sam would tell you that even when it looked good or when the stats were good and they were and because early on in the year, he was completing like over 70% of his passes and had, I think, 10 touchdowns, 0 interceptions through 5 weeks. He would say even through that stretch, the numbers were there, but it just didn't quite look right. And that the system fit maybe wasn't great from what Will had done at Mississippi State to what they're doing at Washington. And the wheels have really fallen off since. Last 6 games, 4 touchdown passes, 7 interceptions. His joke was that basically if Will Rogers starts this game, it must be something written into his NIL contract, because if it's based on performance, it should be Demond Williams. And because Demond Williams is the young quarterback built towards the future. Exactly. Right. So that's what my buddy who's a Washington fan thinks should happen and hopes will happen. I don't know if that'll necessarily be the case. And I guess if I'm being honest, though, one thing we haven't really seen Oregon face this year defensively is a super mobile athletic quarterback. I was thinking through the quarterbacks they've played this year, I guess Purdue's Ryan Brown is the most athletic guy, probably.
I mean, Orgy's the most athletic guy that they've played against.
Yeah,
as
and
a quarterback.
And he was in, again, a sort of a weird, you're right, he probably is more, I was thinking more primary quarterback, but you're right. So they just haven't faced many of those guys, and they actually did a great job against Orgy, although that was mostly in designed runs that were, I guess, predictable. So I will be curious to see if it is Williams primarily, how does Oregon handle the athleticism, his ability to get out and make plays with his feet, because that's something he's shown the ability to do. And also not a bad passer, I think, right? You look at the numbers, completing 72%, 3 touchdowns, no picks. This is a young guy who's played pretty well when he's been in there, but also not a guy who's ever started a game. And that kind of gets me to my other point, which is he could be a really great quarterback, and it maybe doesn't matter all that much because of what's around him and the talent disparity between these 2 teams. And I don't think it's a 1-to-1 comparison, but I remember a guy named Justin Herbert entered this rivalry with his first start, 8 years ago, and he might have played in some really great plays in that game, but it wasn't a particularly competitive game. And I'm definitely not predicting 70-21, to be clear, but it wouldn't surprise me if this is a game where ultimately Williams ends up being a great player. he makes some good plays in this game, but it's not enough to matter because Oregon is just too much for him. So I think the quarterback position, the offensive line for Washington, this is back to Husky fan Sam, those are the things that are concerning for this offense. The receiver talent, Jonah Coleman at running back, I think they've got good tight ends. I think those are all areas they feel pretty good about and have had nice moments this year. I think it's whether or not they can get what they need out of the quarterback. And I think part of the quarterback stuff is going to be dependent upon if that offensive line can protect. And that's been a pretty big issue this year.
Yeah, that's been a big issue. To go on Williams, like I feel like I'd genuinely be kind of surprised if he started. It doesn't feel like the staff kind of like trusts him as much. Some of the numbers kind of indicate that too, where 40 of his 53 passing attempts have been either short or behind the line of scrimmage, according to PFF. So that's 0 to 9 yards or behind the line of scrimmage. So that's, 80% of his passing attempts. He's got 3 passes that have gone down the field more than 20 yards. So this is it seems like he's more of like a short distance where Rodgers just doesn't have the quickness or acceleration to get around the edge and he can go do it. But he can also throw the ball, and he's a true freshman. And his snaps have gone up the last couple of games. He had 27 against UCLA snap-wise. He had 32 against Penn State. They're a 6-5 football team. They have the future ahead of them with Williams Jr. And you might as well give him some run at the end of the season. Like, you've clinched bowl eligibility. You're not as good as you were last year. You're not really fighting for anything other than pride in this game. So maybe he does get the start. Maybe he doesn't. If I'm Washington and I'm really looking to win, I don't know if I'd necessarily start him, but I'd think about it because it's something different. It's something that Oregon, hasn't really seen this year. Obviously, maybe Dan has already talked about, we're anticipating both of them playing. It's like, okay, who is going to start? Maybe it gives them a little bit of an advantage in the first half if Williams Jr. starts, and that kind of, creates some misdirections and some miscues from Oregon's defense. We'll see eventually, but I'm with Eric. I'm more concerned, if I'm concerned about anything for this Washington team, is their pass blocking. Like, that's been a problem a lot this year, and there's some real signs. Their tackles have combined for like 47 pressures this year. 47 pressures this year. I can't do math. That's a lot. And it doesn't really get better from there. You've got 18 from your starting center, which is concerning. You have 24 combined from your starting guards. Not necessarily the best. We'll see if on Saturday if Jordan Burch is able to go, which will be a big thing for Oregon, and we can get to that later. That's kind of one of my factors going into the game for the rush defense. But if Jordan Burch and Tatum and Mateo Uiagalelei are all in the game and are all playing, it's going to be a long day at the office on the perimeter for the tackles. And then again, you have Derek Harmon, you have Jamari Caldwell, who are both capable of rushing the passer. So regardless of who's back there playing quarterback, they could be under pressure all day long. And they might not have the chance to give the ball to Denzel Boston or Giles Jackson, 2 very solid receivers, guys who can play make and get down the field. They might not have the time to do that. And if you look at the pressures allowed against Iowa and against Penn State and against Indiana, who's a solid defense, it's pretty alarming. And I think Oregon has, Penn State's probably the only one that aligns to Oregon. And I think that is that's going to be what this game could come down to eventually, is just how often they can pressure the quarterback. And I think Oregon can do that at will.
Washington will certainly lean on its run game behind Jonah Coleman. He's pretty damn good as a running back. A transfer from Arizona, and he was good at Arizona last season. He's 5th in the conference in rushing yards, just over 1,000. He's in the top 5 for rushing touchdowns this season with 9. Averages just under 100 yards per game running the football, almost 6 yards a carry. He's good, and he's physical, and that's probably where Washington's offense will start and probably stop with is, hey, can we effectively run the football? Because if we can, to your guys' point about protecting the quarterback, they'll probably just run the ball as much as they can to limit the damage to their QBs.
Isn't that weird though, Matt? Like, when we're talking about the last 3 games, I mean, it's just I think it points to how different this Washington program and team is like, to beat Oregon or even be really competitive, I think they have to run the ball well, which is totally counter to what the last 2 seasons at least were under Kalen DeBoer, with obviously Penix at quarterback. But yeah, no, I totally agree. Like, if there's a part of this game that could in theory favor Washington, it would be the run game. And that's largely just Coleman related. And it's interesting too, by the way, because like it's so like he is like the workhorse. Like we don't see that much in college
he's a
football.
true bell cow.
There's no split here. They like Damon Williams Jr. is second in rushes and rushing yards, I think. And they have, I think Cameron Davis has like 150 yards rushing or something like that. And you guys might have the stats pulled up in front, but
190 on 44 carries.
Yeah, and that's their second running back. You know what I mean? And so that sort of points to like this is the Jonah Coleman show. And while I think he's an awesome player, it kind of gets back to what I was getting at before. Like if there's not places to run, what's he going to do? And I feel like Oregon's defensive front has been excellent this year, especially between the tackles. We saw off tackle, even against Wisconsin, by the way, was an issue. But I don't know if the difference is Wisconsin's tackles are really, really good. I don't know if Washington has the offensive tackles or really the offensive guards to give Oregon fits in the run game. And so this might just have to be a Herculean effort from Coleman if they're going to be able to rely on it enough for it to really matter. So that's why I kind of look at this game and think if you would almost hope that Damon Williams plays if you're Washington and he just creates all sorts of weird situations for Oregon's defense, because even though I have a lot of respect for Coleman, I don't necessarily know going into this game that I'm like, he can get 150 yards rushing and carry the load for this game, because I just think Oregon's rush defense and their advantages in the trenches, I think, are going to be really significant.
Yeah, I think you touched on it earlier, Eric, but on the edges, that's where Wisconsin kind of lived in that third quarter, where it seemed like they were going to just do that the rest of the game and go win the football game. Mm-hmm. And that was without Jordan Burch. Ultimately, Oregon decided to just sell out on stopping the run, and it worked. I think Wisconsin had 9 fourth quarter yards on the ground, something like that, where it was like single digits, and then it worked. The problem with this Washington team is you can't, if they're running on the edges and let's say Jordan Burch doesn't play and they can get success there, like Oregon can't just sell out on the run and then leave Will Rogers and his guys to go throw the ball. Like that's just not going to work. He's a better quarterback than Braden Locke. And that's saying a lot because Braden Locke isn't the best quarterback in the world, but it's saying something. And like I said, Boston and Giles Jackson are 2 good receivers. They can cause some problems. So if Jordan Burch plays, I think he's the best defensive edge setter that Oregon has in the roster. And I think that kind of not eliminates, but it certainly helps diminish what Washington can do along the edges. It's not necessarily their primary game. Washington likes to run more inside than anything else. But if they can limit them to one half of the offensive line to go use and try to go set it on Mateo's side or Tatum's side, like Oregon knows what to do then. And then they become more one-dimensional. And then you see what Will Rogers has done the last couple of games against pretty good pass defenses in Penn State and UCLA. And it's like, all right, now you're going to go against one of the better ones in the country in Oregon. So you make them one-dimensional. I think it could be, slim pickings for Washington after that. But we'll see if Burch plays. I think if he does, obviously it's going to help a lot on the pass rush situation. But I think he's the best edge setter that Oregon has on their defensive line, and that's going to help alleviate the run game and try to stop Jonah Coleman, who – a hell of a running back. He's averaging just under 100 yards a game. Like he could, I think you're right, Eric. I think they need him to go for a $120, $140, 2 touchdowns, and just try to give them more options. Try to open the field up for Rodgers and their quarterbacks and their receivers. But it's going to start there. I think you're going to tell pretty early on if Washington's offensive line can get any type of push against Oregon's rested defensive front.
Giles Jackson and Denzel Boston I think they're good. It's just their offensive line is just so bad at protecting, and Will Rogers just hasn't been what they probably expected, because Boston's 6th in the conference in receiving yards. Jackson's is 10th. They're both in the top 6 in receptions this season. Like, I'm not going to sit here and try and argue that they're Ohio State or Ty Felton type level of player or Oregon's caliber. They're a tier below that, but they're good enough where if they get one-on-one opportunities and Oregon's pass rush isn't there, they can make some plays. But I think if we had to choose, hey, you have to pick one side or the other. to make them one-dimensional, you're choosing throwing the football, putting the ball in the air, getting the ball away from Jonah Coleman and running the football.
I think the most controversial thing Husky fan Sam said is he thinks Denzel Boston's as good as any receiver on Oregon's roster.
Oh,
and I don't agree, but I'm putting him on blast for that one. But that also puts into perspective how highly they think of that guy.
Well, I mean,
he's productive, man.
Yeah, he's very productive. I mean, he had like 8 touchdowns in 7 games or 6 games to start the season. He hasn't scored a touchdown though in the last 4 or 5 games, but he's big. He's like 6'4", and he certainly has the big catch radius. So he's got the big player potential. But I would probably take Evan Stewart, and I would definitely take Tez Johnson over Evan Stewart, which we don't know if Tez is going to play or not. All right, let's go to the defensive side of the ball.
I got one more thing.
Yeah.
The passing, like you mentioned, Matt, where we would take the passing situations over the rushing situations. If I went back to the Penn State game. Penn State had 28 pressures in one game against Washington. So again, if you're Oregon, and I feel like this has been the story I've been preaching for many different games on this podcast. If Oregon can stop the run on first or second down and force third and long situations and unleash the dogs, no pun intended, on Washington and Will Rogers, like they can get home. Abdul Carter, who's going to be a top 5 overall draft pick, so he's one of the best players in the country, had 6 pressures by himself. That's something that Derek Harmon and Mateo and Jordan Birch have all done during different games this season. So those guys are all capable of doing that. And if there's 3rd and 9s, 8s, 10s, 12s, and Oregon can show that their perimeter tackling is good enough to shut down screens and really force Rodgers to try to look down the field and throw it to the sticks, I'm not sure he's just going to have enough time. And I think Boston and Josh Jackson, like I said earlier, are really good receivers, but it's not going to matter if Will Rogers just can't throw the ball or Williams can't throw the ball. Like that might just be the instance this week where the pass rush is too great. And again, if Birch is playing, if he's healthy and ready to go, this adds another element to it.
Defensively, this is a unit that sometimes they've been good and sometimes they've been absolutely putrid. I mean, the Iowa game to me,
that one.
You just look at what they were Iowa's offense was able to do. A very boring run the football between the tackles offense, 40 points on this defense. But then we've also seen them, hold USC, and I understand USC's got their own issues, but they have playmakers all over the field to just 21 points. It's hot or cold for this team.
Yeah, I don't think very highly of their rush defense or their line of scrimmage. I think that was my big takeaway in my conversation with Husky fan Sam was just like line of scrimmage on both sides of the ball. They're not where they need to be, and I think that's an area Oregon's capable of exploiting. I don't think I expected to necessarily be like a Caleb Johnson game where he goes and just runs the ball for whatever the total was. I think over 200 yards maybe in that one. I don't necessarily know if I think Jordan James is going to have a day like that, but I think it could be a day where relying on the run game is very profitable, and it probably will be something that they try to. I think they need to commit to establishing that maybe even earlier than they did in Madison. That's not to say they didn't make efforts early, but I think at times they maybe went away from it a little bit. I think this is a game where you can pound the rock a lot, and I hope that that's part of the intent of this game, especially in the first half. And then I'm obviously really curious to see what Oregon's pass game looks like. I think that's been something that we saw take a dip without Tez. We should note we haven't really gotten into it. We usually talk about injuries on this show and kind of updates. We did not get practice access this week. Dan has made it very clear he's not talking injuries this week. We don't really have any updates. Tez has posted he'll play. I expect he'll play because of that, but can't really, confirm or deny that based upon the information we've seen with our own eyes because we haven't seen anything. But assuming he does play, I think that's going to be a real difference maker in this game. I think Washington is pretty capable on the back end. I think Ephesians Prysock is a really good, lengthy, big corner. I think he's like 6'3", 6'4", Arizona transfer. I think they've got good play at safety. I just think Oregon's too dynamic. especially if everybody's there. And I think and kind of hope that we come out of this game feeling like going into Ohio State in the Big Ten championship game, that Oregon's pass game looks a lot more like it did when they played them the first time. Because I think the thing that's been most startling the last couple of weeks without Tez has been that it hasn't looked that way. And I know people have kind of questioned of like, oh, you just take one piece out of it. Is it that big of a deal? I think when it's somebody like Tez, which is such a building block to this offense with the screen game, with the reliability to on 3rd and 6, catch a ball 4 yards down the field, make a guy miss, get the first down, or maybe make a couple of guys miss and get 20 yards. I just think that absence has been significant. And I know I talked about it, I think on our Monday show with Matt, like their yards after catch numbers are significantly down without Tez, and their broken tackles as a team are down without Tez. And I think that's the kind of, ammunition that they need in this game to really get back to where they were before. And I guess the other thing is I think it's gettable over the top. And I know I say that probably almost too often, but I hope that there's a confidence that they can let it fly and let it rip and try to get some deep shots connected on, because I think this is a game where you can hit them. It's been kind of, like I said, it hasn't been great. I think Dylan's thrown some really good balls that haven't been completed. I think Dylan's thrown some bad balls that, if they'd been good balls, would have been completed. I hope this is a game where we see that kind of get back on the same page, because for this offense to be at that height of what we think it can be and what we've seen earlier on in the season, I think they need to get back to connecting on 2 or 3 of those downfield, whether or not those go for 60-yard touchdowns or 45-yard gains, or you're tackled in the red zone or not. Regardless, I think you need to hit a couple of those to really get back to where you were before. But I also think this is a game where if you just run, I was already giving you the blueprint that might work too.
Yeah, the run might work, like just on its own. They might be just fine with that, because there's a couple games this year where Washington has allowed, over 170 yards rushing. Was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 games over 175 yards, 2 games over 220 yards. So it could work. But I agree with you, Eric. Like I think we all think that Oregon is going to win this week. I think it's a reasonably fair assumption. And so, I mean, I'm going in this game and I'm hoping to see, just like you said, Eric, that the passing offense looks a little bit better. If Tez Johnson is playing, I think it automatically will. And that, just like we talked about plenty of times, it gives Dylan Gabriel his safety valve back, somebody he can go and just give the ball to on 3rd down and short or medium or whatever. And if he's not playing, I want to see if Will Stein has added wrinkles where maybe it's Trayshawn Holden hitting the slot and being the safety valve, or it's Evan Stewart, or they're doing something different where it's not just Terrence Ferguson every time where he catches the ball for 5 yards and gets hit immediately and gets like an extra yard, and you hope it's 3rd and 5 and not 3rd and 7. I just kind of want to see that. I think that's like where I'm at going into it. The bye week should certainly help everybody kind of rest up, obviously heal up in the circumstances of Tez and Marcus Harper potentially. But I think that this Washington defense is fine. It's serviceable. They do a good job creating turnovers. Matt talked about how they only allowed 21 points to USC. It's because they forced Miller Moss into 3 interceptions. And despite USC accumulating almost 500 yards of offense, they only scored 21 points because Miller Moss turned it over 3 times. They've got that 3 interception game. They had 2 interceptions against Northwestern. Take it for what it is. And then they had 2 fumbles against UCLA that they coughed up. So they're a good defensive team. At points, there's certainly an obvious, like when they play the better competition, the Indianas, the Penn States, the USCs, in terms of talent-wise, they're not as good. This is an Oregon team that's pretty darn talented in their own right. If I'm Washington, I'm really concerned about it if we're going to stop the run game. They've had 2 weeks to think it out. They've had 2 weeks to game plan and scheme up Oregon's offense. But Oregon has had 2 weeks to scheme up the Washington defense and what they've done well this year. We also haven't seen what Oregon looks like off of a bye in quite a long time. So we have no idea.
It looked pretty good the last time, by the way, if you remember.
It looked okay the last time. We'll see if they come out with some juice. I think they will. I think it's much needed. I don't think the team talked about it like it was that big of a deal that they played 8 straight games. It was very clear against Maryland and Wisconsin that it was physically a big deal. They've had 2 weeks now. Not that they're just sitting on the couch and eating potato chips, but it's a bit more rest than what they're used to. So I think it should be fine. And I think that if they just want to run the ball the entire day and have Dylan Gabriel throw the ball 8 times, they can win. Like Washington has lost games where the opposing quarterback has thrown for under 20 times twice. So I don't think that's going to happen. But if they want to do that, I think that's certainly an element. And I think they'll attack that early.
I want to just real quick go back to Eric's point of, is the offensive struggles related to 2 players? And I think it is. And that's a big question. That's like my big storyline is, can this offense figure things out for this game? Because they're coming off their two lowest games or their 2 lowest total yards of offense in the Big Ten. 363 against Maryland and 354 against Wisconsin. The only game that they've had lower is Boise State, and it was 352. But the difference between that one and these last 2 is it was just simply a time of possession, a play, number of plays that they ran. They ran 57 plays in that game because they had a couple turnovers, yes. But Boise State also moved the football, and they chewed up the clock.
And 2 special teams touchdowns for Oregon, too.
Whereas, Maryland 65 plays, Wisconsin 71 plays. They had 6 more plays in the Wisconsin game. They did it against Ohio State, and they had almost 150 yards less against a worse team defensively, in theory. So I think it is related to not having Tez and to not having Marcus Harper. Now, to Jared's point of like having a bye week, that can help solve some of this because now you can get an extra week to, hey, we really need to get better at these 3 areas. We're going to spend some time and actually hone in on figuring out why it's not working, because you're not game planning that week. You're just skill building. And that could help. The freshness will help. And I agree with Jared, like 8 straight weeks. And not only is it 8 straight weeks of games, 3 of their last 5, they've had to travel to middle America. They've had to be on a plane for a 2,000-mile trip both ways. That factors. Even when you have charter flights, that still becomes a thing. And I was talking with a buddy that was a Wisconsin fan, and he said after the game, he just felt like Oregon looked tired in that game. And I kind of agree with him. Like they had the energy, they were bouncing around, but just physically, you could just tell they were down. And what does this team look like moving forward, with or without Tez? Because I think this is a defense with or without him. And with or without Marcus Harper, you should be able to be better than 363 and 65 plays.
I agree. My only other thing on Washington's defense is Colson Bruner is really good.
Yeah.
And Colson. I said Colson.
No, it's Carson.
Is it Carson? Why did I think it was Colson? Who's Colson Bruner?
So I've been doing this all week as well. Colson Brunner is a former Oregon long snapper.
That's why. Okay, gosh, that makes so much more sense. Okay, I thought I was going to say
doing it all
could have
week
sworn.
too.
Okay, thank you for the correction, and I will have to go back and make sure. And I'm mad at my Husky fan Sam for not correcting me on the phone when I was talking about this Colson guy. He should have hit that. I'll put that on him. My bad. Sorry, Washington. He's a really fun player, and I was about to say, it's funny because I think he and Bryce Betcher are like identical players. Like it's like a Spider-Man meme, like just size, athleticism, the way they play. And so part of me goes into this game excited to just see how Oregon addresses him, because he's one of like 3 players in this defense that was like even rotational a year ago. And he's, I think, pretty clearly their best defensive player, I think by a wide margin. So sometimes when there's a player of that caliber who's playing linebacker, they can clean up a lot of stuff that the deficiencies of the defensive line, or maybe some of the deficiencies in coverage, just because of their skill set. I'll be curious to see his involvement in this game. He has, I think, been double-digit tackles 3 of the last 4 games. So that's Carson Bruner is a guy to keep an eye on. Got it.
Yeah, he's great. I love watching him play. He's, like you said, Eric, he's very similar to Bryce Betcher, kind of old school linebacker-y, more athletic than a dude who might have played in the 90s. But he's I thought he was in college for like 8 years at this point. I feel like it's just been a Washington staple is Carson Brunner at linebacker. And no, he's just played all 4 years. He's just been damn good. He's been playing since his freshman year. And last year he played a ton. This year he's playing a ton. I think he's already matched his career high in tackles with this full game left to go. So he's having a standout year. But theoretically, next year, he will not be patrolling Washington's linebacking group for what feels like the first time since 2014.
All right, let's take a quick break, and then we'll come back and start making our predictions for this weekend's game. All right, welcome back to the Autzen Audibles Podcast. Prediction time. The standings are really clumped together now. All that separates myself and Eric from first place is a tie. And Jared has made up ground and is within striking distance where he could still win by 2 or 3 if he has a really big game this week.
So wait, are you up by half a point?
Yes.
Oh,
I have
gosh.
2 ties. I'm at 60-48-2. You're at 60-49-1.
All of this is going to come down to me not writing 55.5 for Evan Stewart
100%.
receiving yards against Maryland, and he had 55, and I took the under. It's all going to come back to me. It's about the details, Eric. And by the way, I'm proud. I actually did write Carson Brunner on my story earlier this week, identifying players to know. So I had that right. It was just the podcast. My bad.
All right, so Eric, you can go first. You handled the team prop bets.
Yeah, let's see here. Let's start with over under 2.5 different seniors find the end zone. I thought this would be a fun one. We haven't noted it so far on this pod, but this is senior day. A lot of guys that are seniors on this team, most of them didn't spend their entire careers here, but on offense, quite a few of them are guys that will be factors in this offense. Basically, everyone who catches a pass is a senior. Jordan James being a running back, he's a junior. No Whittington, technically a junior, so those guys don't come into it. But if Dylan Gabriel gets in the end zone, that's another senior. So I did go over on this because I think there will be enough variance in the pass game to get multiple seniors in the end zone. And shoot, maybe we see something from the defense there too.
I'm going to go over as well here. Kind of what you laid out, Eric. Like everybody who catches a pass or basically who scores is going to be a senior. So, except for Jordan James, but I think that there's a really good chance that there's just 3 dudes who score. I don't know who they're going to be, but I'll take 3 seniors.
Yeah, I also went the over on this one. I just think whether it's Ferguson, Holden, Gabriel might run in as well. So I took the over.
Tez, if he's playing, obviously. Yeah. Okay. Over under 1.5 turnovers forced. In my mind, maybe I'm just buying into the Damon Williams Jr. stuff because of my conversation yesterday. I could just see a scenario where he throws the ball around a lot. So over under 1.5 turnovers forced. I'm going over on that because while he's really athletic and maybe makes some plays Will Rogers doesn't make, I could also see him being in a spot where he gets clobbered and fumbles the ball or makes a play he shouldn't because you're going against elite defensive talent that you don't normally see. And of course, this is his first start in a hostile environment against a team that frankly is better. So either way, I think the turnover play here is possible because Will Rogers has been throwing it to the other team a lot too.
Yeah, I'm going to go under here. It's a tough one to predict that there's going to be 2 turnovers. I won't be in the least bit surprised that there's at least 1 turnover here. But I just think it's hard to predict 2. And despite Will Rogers turning the ball over a little bit recently, and I could see that Damon Williams gets in there and starts, that there's going to be more opportunities for Oregon to make some plays. I have a tough time predicting 2 turnovers. So I'm going to take the under here.
I'm taking the over because I've got full confidence in Oregon's run defense to put Washington in enough situations where they have to throw the football. And ball in the air, Oregon will make the plays needed to get the ball.
I thought I'd make
fumble interception.
I thought I'd make this one interesting. Will this game feature a special teams turnover of any kind? We've seen some kind of funky stuff in special teams, obviously Oregon game related, but if you watch the NFL or college football rate closely, there's been a lot of funky stuff here. I'm saying no, though, but I also am aware, onside kick would qualify. And this feels like a game where Dan maybe pulls out another funky
a missile to an up man,
something weird out of the bag of tricks, because it seems like every week there's one or two funky things that they want to put out there. So I said no, but I wouldn't be surprised at all if we just see something funky here, or there's a misplaying of a punt kick, something like that. But I did take the no.
I'm going to go no as well. Again, it could certainly happen. And as for the onside kick thing, that didn't come first to mind. It really just kind of felt like a muff punt would happen. I think Oregon's going to be up by enough where an onside kick might not be in their greatest interest, that they'd rather just kick it off. So I'm going to go with no here.
I'm also no. I just don't think it happens. But rivalry games, crazy games, usually something weird, strange like that happens. So, but I'm going to say no.
All right. Offensive prop bets. Over under 293.5 passing yards for Dylan Gabriel. It's a very specific line because 293 yards is the most amount of yards that Washington's pass defense has allowed this year. To the aforementioned Miller Moss, who threw either 50 or 60 times. I can't remember. It was an absurd amount. So 293.5 yards for Dylan Gabriel. I'm going under. We've talked about it on the podcast. This one's very specifically that the passing offense just hasn't really been there, and it's not necessarily what they'll need to do this week in order to win. So I'm going under.
293.5 was also significant to me because it's really close to what Dylan Gabriel's average was pre-Tez Johnson injury. And because of that, and because I think Tez is playing, I took the over. Confidence level is not really high, but part of me really thinks this is a game where it's important to kind of show you've made some strides and you've kind of re-engaged the pass offense. So, and again, I know Washington defensively has done really well against the pass this year statistically. I also say look at the quarterbacks.
Yeah.
Same reason. Mm-hmm. I think Oregon's defensive stats against the pass are awesome. I think those are slightly inflated, deflated, however you want to term it, based upon the caliber of pass offense they've faced. And this is a much better pass offense than Washington's played, besides probably USC. So I did take the over.
I'm taking the over for very similar reasons to Eric. I think Tez plays, and I think Tez playing makes life significantly easier for Dylan and for the offense. Last time, though, he hit 293 or more is the Michigan game, and he hit 294. That was without Tez for basically the entire game, but I'm taking the over.
Next up, over under 170.5 rushing yards for the Ducks. This one I kind of just ballparked as like a rough average. There's only been 3 games this year that Washington has allowed under 100 yards rushing. There's been 5 games where they've allowed over 170 yards rushing. So I put the line right at that 170-yard marker if Oregon will add on to it. I took the over here. I think that this is going to be a healthier offensive line. It's going to be a healthier Jordan James. It's going to be a healthier Noah Whittington or whoever else runs the ball back there, including Dylan Gabriel. I think 170 yards should be, or 171 yards, I should say, should be well within their grasp.
Also took the over. I think it's within the realm of possibility that they can get there without involving Dylan in the run game. But I have a sneaking, I have a sneaking suspicion that they might want to incorporate him a little bit. Seems like in some of these bigger games, and I know maybe you don't think Washington's a big game because they're 6-5, but it's still a rivalry game. They've incorporated him a little bit more and with some great success. So I almost included a prop bet of a rushing touchdown for Dylan Gabriel in this game. I could just see them maybe pulling off, similar to Oregon State, a long run off of something designed for him. But either way, I'm going over on this.
They hit 171 5 times this season at Oregon State, against Michigan State, Illinois, Michigan, and then Maryland. I'm taking the over, but I think the number is pretty good in terms of yes or no. But I think with Oregon's running game, and I think Harper plays too, and I think that's going to open things up a little bit. I think this is going to be one of the better offensive performances we've seen probably in the last 4 or 5 weeks for Oregon.
All right, final one here. Over under 5.5 players with a reception. This is just me thinking that Oregon's passing game is going to try to get to that magic 294 number, even though I don't want them to get there. I just think that they're going to try to spread the rock around. And frankly, if Tez Johnson is back this week, which I think he might be. I mean, Dan won't tell us, but Tej will tell us on his social media. If he comes back, that's another dude who can catch a pass. So I took the over here. I think at least 6 people will catch a football this weekend.
I took the under. I was trying to think it through here, and I think some of it's contingent on how many receivers they incorporate. And if Tez is back, does Gary still have a role? What's Justice Lowe's involvement? And by the way, Justice, like, how healthy is he? I mean, we haven't really heard much about it. I know he went back in the game against Wisconsin, but he took a pretty big shot there. How involved is he? So I took the under because I'm kind of wondering if it is a Tez game, maybe this is focused on 4 or 5 guys as opposed to 6.
I'm taking the over here as well as Jared. I just think with Tez back and with Justice Lowe playing, with Trayshawn Holden playing, with Gary Bryant now also playing, Evan Stewart, there's enough guys out there that 6 guys are going to catch a pass. And I'd be pretty shocked if it was like 3 or 4 guys. So I'll take the over. All right, over defensive prop bets here. Over under Oregon, 3.5 sacks on the game. Washington's allowing just a tick over 2. Oregon's averaging just a tick over 2.5. Felt like 3 just wasn't enough to really make it questionable. So I made it 3.5, and I'm going to take the over here. I think there's going to be a lot of passing situations for Washington, and that's just the worst case scenario against this defensive front. And they'll get home for 4 sacks or more.
I went over, and again, I'm probably over here thinking Williams is going to play more than maybe he will. But I think if he does play, I know he's the more active and agile player, but sometimes those are the guys who get sacked more because they try to do a little bit more. Maybe they trust that they can get away. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if there are some plays where he thinks my athleticism is going to allow me to get out of the pocket and go somewhere. And Mateo or Jordan or Tatum or maybe even Derek Harmon's able to kind of run him down and pull him down before he gets going. So the over feels like something that can hit. And I really do think the biggest advantage either team has in this game is Oregon's defensive line against Washington's offensive line. And I think that's going to play out on Saturday.
Yeah, I took the over here too. I think it's pretty simple what Eric finished with there. I think Oregon's defensive line is a superior advantage to Washington's offensive line. When you look at the really good defensive lines that Washington has played this year against Michigan and Penn State specifically, they're giving up a lot of pressures, they're giving up a lot of quarterback hurries, and they're giving up some sacks. So I'm going to take Oregon's defensive line to kind of eat this game.
Over under Jabbar Muhammad's total passes defended, interceptions, or passes broken up at 1.5. He has 9. Those are all passes broken up. He has no interceptions this season. I'm taking the over, though. I don't know why. I usually don't do these ones, but I just have a feeling he's going to have a moment or two in a game against, which is strange to say, like his former team.
Yeah, I was. He of all the people who downplayed this game and the significance, he was the most yesterday on Tuesday. And by the way, we should note we'll talk to Bryce Betcher and Terrence Ferguson later on Wednesday, and maybe one of them will say something that will catch our eyes. And if it's going to be somebody, it's probably Bryce in terms of reiterating this rivalry game. But to this prop bet, I also took the over. It kind of goes back to, I think Matt made that point earlier of like, I think they're going to be throwing the ball a lot in this game. And if that's the case, there's going to be enough quantity maybe for Jabbar to be targeted where he's able to make some plays. And like, it would be kind of fitting if he gets his first interception against his old team. So sign me up for that sort of sneakily. That might be a Scopeldamus pick for Thursday as well.
Oh boy. Not a Scopeldamus. I took the over here as well. I didn't like it. I didn't like taking the over here. I kind of felt like Matt, where it's really tough to predict these things. I think I'm just going to say it's poetic that it's going to come against Washington, where he's going to get his, at least 2 passes defended. I don't like the pick. I regret saying the over, but we're going to do it anyways.
There we go. All right, last one. Over under 238.5 Washington passing yards. That would be the second most passing yards Oregon has allowed this season. 326 is the highest for Ohio State. And the next closest is Maryland of all schools at just 200 106 yards passing. I'm taking the under, but just like the previous one, I'm expecting Washington to throw the ball a lot, and then I guess now not have a lot of success throwing it. But they've got some guys at receiver that can make some plays. But I just think the offensive line, it's where I keep going back to it. I sound like a broken record. I just think Oregon's going to dominate the line of scrimmage. So 238.5, I'm taking the under.
This is probably like one of the harder ones for me. I know what the Oregon defensive stats say about how they've defended. I also just keep coming back to the point of like the caliber of receiver in this conference, and especially the caliber of quarterback hasn't been great. I took the under because of the kind of lack of clarity at quarterback. I think if Will Rogers was playing the way he was to start this season, where he looked like pretty effective in the offense, I thought had some nice moments, obviously against lesser competition, then the over probably make more sense for me. I just think the uncertainty of whether it's Rogers or Williams, I'm going to lean under. But this is a good line, and that was kind of a tough one for me.
I'm going to go over here. Washington has hit this mark in 8 of their 11 games this year. I think we talked about it earlier where Oregon's going to have to force them to be one-dimensional, or at least I talked about it earlier, stopping the run on early downs and forcing them to third and long situations. I agree with Matt that the pass rush is going to get there for Oregon, but it doesn't get there every time. And in those situations, I think Denzel Boston and Giles Jackson can make a situation where it is a 3rd and 9, they go get 11 or 12. I expect Oregon to be up in this game for most of the game, and Washington will have to battle back, and you don't necessarily do that running. So I'm going to take the over, but it's going to be one of those performances where you're after the game, you're like, yeah, Oregon's defense was pretty darn good. It's just Will Rogers had kind of like useless counting stats by the end of it.
All right, score predictions. I'll go first. Oregon is a 19-point favorite. That seems like a really big number, but it also seems like one that is kind of attainable. I just don't think if they're going to do that. They're this season in spreads where they're 3-score favorites or more, they're just 3 and 5 and covering that spread. It's a big number. It's hard to do. I do think they're going to win. I think they'll dominate the line of scrimmage on both sides of the football, honestly. I think they're just significantly better, and they're deeper in the trenches on both sides. Quarterback play is a concern for me for Washington. They have guys that individually could match up well with Oregon, but they just don't have enough of them. And they don't have them in key spots that are going to be critical in this one. So I'm taking Oregon to win this game 35-17, but I think it's going to be similar to like a UCLA or a Michigan State type game where Washington moves the ball a little bit. They do have a little bit of success. Oregon is clearly the better team, but they also don't throw like 49 points on the scoreboard.
Matt, it's funny you brought up those games because I think those are comparable matchups too, and Oregon won by 21 points in both of those games, which is basically the line I have here. I do think they will cover. I have 37-17. Funky score there. Maybe some 2-point trickery doesn't work out, or maybe it does a couple times. I think we've kind of established, like, by the way, like a game that doesn't have a lot of juice because I think we kind of all know where it's going. And I think that's both sides. Like that's both sides of the fan bases. Like I think Washington fans have very little confidence that they'll win this game or be that competitive. And I think Oregon fans are just really excited to put it on Washington after the last couple of years and after hearing all that chirping. Last point from Husky fan Sam was like, he just hopes that they can keep it within this margin. And I'm predicting they won't. So I think this will be a game where, regardless of who's at quarterback for Washington, I think they're going to struggle to keep up, and I think that's in part because I think this is a game that feels a lot like UCLA and Michigan State in particular, where maybe there are some issues in the red zone. I'm not necessarily predicting that, but just remember how those games felt offensively for Oregon. It was like the other team had no chance to slow them down, and I think that's what this is going to feel like. And I think ultimately for Oregon, this is going to be a game that is pretty cathartic of just against Washington the last couple of times. They weren't able to separate, obviously. They weren't able to win those games. I think they're going to be able to separate fairly early in this game. And I think that's going to be cathartic because of the rivalry matchup in past history, but also because of the last couple of times out where they also had a hard time doing that in games where, once again, they were big favorites and expected to win by more. I think this is a game where it kind of comes together more. I think coming off the bye week is big. I think you're going to start seeing some of the key guys come back. And I think just in general, I think this is going to feel a lot more like the team that was playing the way it was, kind of like around the Illinois game, parts of the Michigan game, and a little bit less like the team we saw last against Wisconsin, where everything was just kind of didn't quite feel like it was firing on all cylinders.
Yeah, I agree. I've got Oregon winning 38-23. Some field goals there for Washington towards the end. I think that this is very similar in terms of how we've seen the season for Oregon in basically every single one of their matchups. Like, this is the far superior team. If they do everything how they expect to do it, they should win, going away. And I think Washington will come out with a lot of fervor and intensity, like right out of the gates, because this is as big of a game for them in this season as there is. It's the last game of the season, and B, it's against the rival Oregon, and C, if you beat them, then that ruins Oregon's perfect conference season, which hasn't happened since 2010. There's a lot of history between these two teams. I think one thing that could be a downside of this rivalry is that not a lot of returners on this Washington team from a season ago, where there were a lot of guys who were there in 2022 as well. I think there's a lot of potential here for Oregon to run up the score. I don't necessarily see it. Actually, kind of, my brain is telling me it's kind of like a close start in the first quarter before Oregon pulls away in the second and then gets the ball back and scores in the third, and then it's all of a sudden like an 18, 17-point lead. Mm-hmm. I just think that the offense, I anticipate Tez coming back. We'll see on Saturday, obviously. I think the offense is going to look how it did earlier in the season, like you guys both mentioned. I think the defense is going to have some real progress here, especially if Birch is back for the game. Again, they're coming off a bye week. I can't stress how important that is for teams. You looked at how Oregon's opponents have played them the last couple of weeks, all coming off byes, and how much better they looked than what they did the previous week. I expect Oregon to have some of that and build some momentum going into the Big Ten championship. So I've got Oregon winning by 15, but again, it wouldn't surprise me if the margin is larger. And I think that means less points for Washington more than 38 points for Oregon. I think the defense could have a chance to do a really good job this week.
Real quick, Dylan Gabriel's Heisman hopes is basically on life support, like the last couple of weeks.
Mm-hmm.
Do we think if the opportunity presents itself, Oregon tries to kind of juice those back up a little bit with a big game, or is this just, as he puts it, I don't care about any of that stuff, I just want to win?
I think if it happens organically, I had my own kind of like last parting thought question, which was, do you think if there's a chance to like really put this one on Washington and like quote unquote run up the score, will they take it? And I kind of think the answer is not with the starters on the field. I think with everything that's in front and a game for a conference championship the next week, I don't think they're going to want to risk any of that. We've seen Cam Ward at Miami a couple times this year, like score a lot of garbage points late. I don't think that's part of this operation. I just think we've seen enough this year, and maybe the emotions of the Washington thing. That's part of the reason I was going to bring it up, because I had a buddy of mine and I were talking about this a couple of days ago. Of like, do you think Dan would take it because of what happened the last couple of times? I don't know if that's in play. But to your point, or to your question, Matt, I also don't think like they're going to keep him in through the fourth quarter in a game they're up a bunch just to get him 5 touchdowns and 320 passing yards. I think it's more of like, shoot, if it's there all game and he's hitting it, they'll do it. But I don't necessarily think they're going to force it. But maybe they'll feel wrong. I also didn't necessarily know they were going to be chasing Bo Nix's all those records in the bowl game against Liberty last year, and they sure did, and they sure came out and said they were. So maybe I'll look silly for saying that, but that's my instinct.
I think the Dylan Gabriel Heisman chances are all but over.
I agree.
think just how Boise State is playing and how Travis Hunter has become the unanimous popular vote favorite for what he's doing on the field. I think Genty probably deserves it more in terms of just his production, but it's a different conversation. So, I mean, I think they'll try. If they're up by 35, I don't know if they'll try to go up by 42, but they'll certainly try to go up by 35. And then for kind of the same thing with Eric's question, it's like, I don't know if they'll put it on them. I think that there's much more important things down the road that they're going to try to go do. Like, obviously, you want to beat every team every week. But But if you're up by 21 in the fourth quarter against Washington, I don't think any of the starters are going to be seeing the field.
Yeah, I think my answer is somewhere similar. I think as long as it's the third quarter, I think Dylan will probably be playing.
Oh,
unless, unless
This is crazy, yeah.
Yeah, unless it's just absolutely crazy. Which if it's crazy, then you've done your part already because you scored a boatload of points. But I agree. I don't think if it's 17-point lead with 10 minutes to go in the fourth quarter and Oregon gets the ball back, like he may go in, but it'll probably be just run, kill the clock, keep your guys safe, get out of here. And he may not even play in that kind of a scenario. So I don't think they're going to chase it unless it's like how Eric put it, organically. But if it's a 3-score game in the third quarter, he's in, and I would think they would still try to take their shots. So
yeah. Well, I was just going to say, and because I can't think of a time really where they pulled starters in the third quarter under Dan, like just almost in general.
I don't think this game's going to be like that. Where
I don't either. I'm just saying I don't see it happening. Yeah.
All right, that's going to do it for us. Next time you hear from us will be late Saturday night following the final game of the regular season from Autzen Stadium. But until then, you've been listening to the Autzen Audibles Podcast.
Talk to you later, folks.
Peace.